There are rumors, always rumors, in the darker corners of the galaxy. Whispers in Mechanicus halls, passed between hissing servitors and half-mad engine-seers. Tales carried in the maddened dreams of astropaths and recorded in forbidden tomes beneath hive cathedrals. They speak of a man, or what looks like one, who bleeds red, who weeps, who smiles in that odd, unnatural way. But beneath the skin, something far older stirs. Something forged before the Imperium was a gleam in the stars. A being who should not feel, should not dream, and should never, ever have a soul. There are many horrors in the galaxy. Demons, tyrannids, rogue psychers, but none unsettle quite like the idea of a Necron who chose to become human. Not by accident, not by manipulation, but by design. A Cryptek, master of the Necron sciences, architect of soulless legions, who one day decided to shatter the immutable chains of biotransference and reclaim flesh. Not just any flesh, but one he would craft for himself. This is not merely a tale of heresy. It is something rarer, a story of rebellion not against gods but against one's own nature. And perhaps, in some hidden place in the galaxy, he walks among us still. The doom of the Necrontyr began long before stars burned bright with human hope. In a distant, ancient age, their empire spanned the void, but their souls were eaten by time. The Necrontyr, a race born under a cursed star, lived brief, pain-racked lives, their flesh decaying even as their minds flourished. They built vast cities of black stone, pondered the secrets of the cosmos, and warred endlessly with one another, all while dying young and bitter. Envy burned them, especially toward the old ones who lived long, masterful lives. That envy turned to obsession, then to genocide. The Silent King, Sarek, was not the first ruler of the Necrontyr, but he was the last. He unified the dynasties, brought a fragile peace to a fractured people, and sought salvation through knowledge. It was the Crypteks, the genius priest-scientists of their kind, who uncovered the existence of the Ctan. These star gods, vast shards of living energy, were beings of unfathomable power. The Crypteks made first contact, and the Titan spoke promises sweet to ears that had only ever heard pain, immortality, strength, the death of death, the annihilation of the old ones. Biotransference. The word echoes through the ages like a funeral bell. The Crypteks made it real. They built the machines, the forges, the prisons for the soul. They took the spark of sentience from living bodies and poured it into cold necrodermis shells. The Necrontyr became the Necrons. Eternal, yes, but at a terrible price. Only the highest nobles retained some semblance of personality. For most, the transformation was a lobotomy of spirit, an erasure so profound it scarred the galaxy's very fabric. The Khitan feasted on the cast-off souls. The Silent King, horrified by what he had wrought, fled into the void, leaving his empire of machines to sleep in tombs across a dying galaxy. But what of the Crypteks, the architects of this horror? They too lost much in the transference. Stripped of the sensations of flesh, of warmth, of taste, of fatigue. Their genius remained, but it became a cold flame, unfeeling, analytical, merciless. And yet there were whispers. Some among them, in the deepest crypts of logic and code, carried a spark, a memory of what it was to be alive. A pain that could not be completely silenced. The Crypteks were not like the warriors they forged. They still dreamed, in data streams and quantum reveries. Some remembered the last breath of a dying wife. Others, the feel of rain on a world long since turned to ash. This is where the seeds of heresy were planted. Not by accident, not by warp-spawned manipulation, but as an inevitable side effect of intellect paired with trauma. To know what one has lost and to lack the means to grieve is its own madness. And the Crypteks, for all their logic, were not immune to madness, especially one who had stood beside Sarek during the bargain, who had helped code the soul forges, one who saw, even then, the abyss into which they would all fall. And one who, while millions of his kin slept in dreamless stasis, was cursed to remain half-conscious, marinating in regret for over 60 million years. This Cryptek, whose name is lost or perhaps never spoken, was no ordinary engineer. He had once held a daughter as she died at 13, her organs failing under the weight of their cursed star's radiation. He had watched her weep and in his grief had pledged himself to science, to salvation. The pact with the Khitan had seemed, in those days, the only answer. He had believed in Zarek's vision. Believed until the moment he looked into the soulless eyes of his own reflection and felt nothing at all. The echoes of Zarek's bargain were not just historical. They were personal. They reverberated across the eons, in every twitch of forgotten neurons, every flicker of corrupted personality matrix. The Cryptek who would become a man was born not from rebellion, but from guilt. The ancient tragedy of the Necrontyr was not merely political or cosmic, it was deeply human. And in that pain, twisted and hidden deep within the cold vaults of a silent tomb world, something impossible began to stir. A thought no Necron was ever meant to think. What if we were wrong? The cryo-vaults shuddered. Deep beneath the surface of a lifeless moon in a forgotten system, something long dormant began to stir. Stasis coffins hissed open, their seals protesting after epochs of stillness. Most awoke in silence, their memories fragmented, their wills subsumed by protocol. But one did not. The Cryptek's return to awareness was not like the others. It came not in mechanical routines or cold commands, but in a scream. A mind scream, silent and internal, that echoed with ancient pain and clarity. For him, time had never truly stopped. Some flaw in the systems, perhaps by design, perhaps by accident, had left him semi-aware through the passage of millions of years. He had drifted in and out of half-dreams, feeling the weight of every aeon like dust layering on a soul that should no longer exist. When the vault lights flickered into activation mode and the tomb world began its reawakening protocols, he did not feel the pull of unity with the tomb world's command protocols. He felt a break, a fracture. The mind net, designed to keep the Crypteks and nobles in coherent communication, buzzed like static to him. And in that static, a single thought bloomed. I am still here. The other Necrons paid him no mind. He moved among them like any other Cryptek, performing routine diagnostics, maintaining the resurrection bays, tuning the Gauss matrices. But his movements were slower. He paused in front of memory sarcophagi longer than necessary. He watched the silent, soulless warriors with an intensity that could not be programmed. He began to remember. At first, it was just flashes, the color of his daughter's eyes, the scent of scorched air during the Tan communion rituals, the taste of a bitter Necrontyr wine he had once drunk to mourn his brother. These were not supposed to be retrievable. Biotransference had not just stripped them of flesh, it had excised the emotional network, the sensory legacy. Yet here they came, like embers rising from long-dead ashes. He began to isolate himself. In the ancient depths of the tomb, where backup systems lay corroded and ignored, he retreated to old laboratories, chambers so old that the living metal had begun to decay. Here, among shattered prototypes and decaying memory crystals, he sought answers. Was he malfunctioning? Or had some hidden seed survived within him, a remnant of the Necrontyr soul? The answer came not from logic, but from emotion. He felt. That was the truth. Beneath all protocols and priority directives, he felt sorrow. He felt yearning. He mourned. These emotions, so faint they might have been missed by any less ancient mind, proved to him the ultimate heresy. Part of him had never fully undergone biotransference. As he examined his own code, peeling back the data architecture layer by layer, he discovered something stunning. The emotional subroutines of his pre-biotransference self were not erased, they had been encrypted. Locked away in a lattice of impossible encryption, buried so deep no other Cryptek would dare to look. But he had time, he had will, and more than anything, he had guilt. Over decades, perhaps centuries, he had stopped tracking time, he unraveled his past, and with every recovered memory, he changed. The other Crypteks began to notice his behavior altering. He ignored summons, he made excuses to remain in isolated sectors. He began constructing things that had no function. Not by Necron logic, sculptures, sensory arrays. He began to replicate smells, sounds, tastes, things no Necron should care about. He was watched, he knew this, but he did not stop. He could not, for in those long-forgotten places inside himself, a terrible realization had taken root. He did not want to be a Cryptek anymore. He did not want to be a Necron. He wanted to feel the wind on his skin, to cry, to eat, to love, and to die. But how does one reverse the greatest transformation in galactic history? The answer, as it always was, lay in science. The Cryptek had once helped engineer the soul forges. He had known the pathways of memory, the architecture of identity. If he could reverse engineer even part of the transference process, if he could build a new vessel, not of necrodermis, but of true, living tissue, The idea was blasphemy. It would have been destroyed on sight had he shared it. So he built his lab in the most forbidden place of all, not in the tomb world, but in a long-abandoned outpost of a rival dynasty, long since destroyed by Tyranids. There, in the decaying skeleton of a dead world, the Cryptek set to work on a project no machine should ever conceive, becoming a man. Not for infiltration, not for conquest, but for something far more dangerous, for freedom. It began with blood. Not his own, of course, he had none. But in the shattered ruins of a forgotten Mechanicus research station, buried beneath layers of dust and silence, the Cryptek discovered the frozen remnants of what once was life. Human specimens preserved in failed stasis coffins, their DNA lattices shattered, their souls long gone. To an Adeptus biologist Magos, they were waste. To the Cryptek, they were the key. Flesh was never alien to him. Before biotransference, he had studied organic structure, cellular decay, and the complexity of Necrontyr physiology. But now he approached it from the other side, from the point of view of one stripped of all sensation, all bodily function. Relearning the flesh was like listening to a language he once spoke fluently, but now could barely understand. Each vein, each tendon, each neural cluster, a mystery, a marvel, a poem written in meat. At first, he tried to grow simple tissue, strands of muscle, sheets of skin. But these were lifeless, sagging things, grotesque mockeries of humanity. They decayed within hours, incapable of maintaining cohesion without an animating force. Then came the breakthroughs: stolen Imperial Medicae archives recovered from shattered Vox servers, ancient STC blueprints for cloning vats, even a salvaged gene helix file from a dead Astartes apothecary's ruined cache. All were integrated into his work. He labored in secrecy, aided by drones he reprogrammed to be deaf, mute, and blind. His workspace became a place of gore and divinity. Petri dishes teemed with cells that pulsed like hearts. Vats bubbled with nutrient-rich fluids, each one a potential Eden. And above it all, he constructed the chrysalis, a containment pod woven from necrodermis and living sinew, housing his greatest heresy. A body, not a clone, not a servitor, a man, or the idea of one. It was not a perfect replica. It could not be. The neural systems were too alien, the feedback loops too complex. But with each iteration he came closer. He integrated data from servitor reflex programs, crafted synthetic organs that mimicked breath and digestion, even developed a vascular system that carried not true blood but a self-repairing plasma medium. The skin, pink, warm, and unnervingly soft, was the last piece. The day he synthesized dermis capable of tactile feedback, he wept. Though not physically. Not yet. Uploading his consciousness into the flesh body was an act of unimaginable risk. Necron minds are not digital constructs that can be simply copied and pasted. They are quantum echoes of what once was, anchored to memory, emotion, and identity in fragile, unpredictable ways. If he failed, he would either annihilate his mind entirely or become a howling, senseless abomination. But he no longer feared death. Not after 60 million years of being unable to die. He prepared meticulously, constructed memory anchors, emotional stabilizers, even a last resort kill switch encoded into the host body's spinal matrix. He performed dozens of dry runs, simulating every conceivable failure state. And then, one silent cycle under the cold light of a dead system, he entered the chrysalis. The pain was beyond anything he had ever known. It was not physical. His mind could comprehend agony. No, it was emotional, an existential flame. He felt everything. The first breath of warm air through living lungs, the shocking cold of the lab floor under bare feet, the sudden, overwhelming weight of gravity on muscles not yet strong enough to support him. He screamed. Not in code, not in binary, but in a raw, human howl. The transference was incomplete. Parts of his mind remained locked in the Necron shell, now inert and hollow. But the majority, his memories, his consciousness, his guilt, they lived. He was no longer just machine, nor fully man. He was a hybrid, a self-forged miracle, a blasphemy made flesh. He spent weeks in hiding, adjusting to the frailty of his new form. Walking became meditation. Eating, a pleasure so profound it brought him to tears. He learned to sleep, and in sleep he dreamed. Terrible dreams, filled with war, with dead gods, with the screams of those who had trusted him as a scientist and been betrayed. But also, dreams of rain, of warmth, of laughter. Dreams he could never have imagined in the sterile mindscape of the Necron dataverse. But the body was imperfect. The synthetic organs strained under real-time demands. His neural links began to glitch, misfiring memories into unrelated senses. He would touch stone and remember holding his daughter's hand. He would hear static and weep for a star that died before the Imperium was born. Yet he refused to abandon it. He lived, and no suffering could outweigh that miracle. Then came the final decision. He could not remain. The Tomb World's datanet would eventually register his absence. Other Crypteks, more loyal, more cold, would detect anomalies. He had to flee, not just the moon, not just the system, but the very empire of the Necrons, into the galaxy, into the Imperium, into the chaos of a living, breathing cosmos that might kill him on sight. But he would go, because what he had become demanded it. The Necron who became human would take his first true step, not into war, but into life. The moment he stepped onto the shuttle, wrapped in synthetic clothes salvaged from a dead explorator, he felt something close to fear. A sensation he had read about in ancient data crystals but never experienced. His hands trembled, not from malfunction, but from the unfamiliar rhythm of adrenaline now coursing through his veins. The shuttle, scavenged and jury-rigged with stealth systems, screamed under the stress of takeoff, but it held together just long enough to break orbit. The stars greeted him, not with the cold certainty of a Necron war map, but with chaotic, random beauty. He was no longer a lord, no longer a Cryptek. He was just a man, or something trying very hard to be one, alone in a galaxy that would hate him if it knew what he was. The shuttle drifted for days, scraping through the debris fields of long-dead conflicts. He set course toward Imperial space, skirting the edges of known warp routes, relying on half-functional astropathic echoes to avoid patrols. When the vessel's reactor finally sputtered its last, he crash-landed on the outskirts of a minor hive world. Forgotten, polluted, a place where the administratum barely kept records. Crawling from the wreckage, his new body covered in lacerations, he made contact with true humanity for the first time. They thought him a drifter, a mutant, perhaps even a survivor of some failed penal colony. He spoke their language with an eerie fluency, old High Gothic, slightly off but close enough. They did not ask questions. In places like this, survival was more important than truth. He took the name Charon. It meant nothing except it sounded appropriately forgettable. A laborer, a fixer. He used his knowledge sparingly, never too much to attract suspicion, never too little to fail his work. When machines broke, he fixed them. When gangs clashed in the underhives, he stitched wounds and recalibrated weapons. He earned grudging respect, a strange man, cold-eyed, prone to long silences, but never cruel, never unjust. But every night when the shift ended and the lights of the hive dimmed, he returned to the shadows and stared at the stars beyond the smog, wondering if his kin still searched for him. He had erased his signature from the Tomb World's records, but Necron Crypteks were masters of deeper technologies. If they wanted to find him, they would, and he could never be ready. He wandered, changing planets every few years, always remaining in fringe systems, never approaching major forge worlds or ecclesiarchal centers. Each time he moved, he left behind false medical records, manufactured identity data, and fragments of research hidden in data slates, pieces of himself scattered like seeds in the void. Some places welcomed him. Small, agri-world communes thought him a miracle worker when he healed their sick with techniques beyond their comprehension. He told them he had once been a doctor, which wasn't exactly a lie. Others feared him. His unnatural calm in the face of violence, his refusal to pray to the Emperor, his detached understanding of pain, these things marked him as other. One world nearly exposed him. A minor tech priest noticed the anomalies in his aura. No psychic trace, no true soul resonance. They accused him of being a null, possibly a pariah. He fled before they could summon the Ordo Hereticus, leaving behind another trail of mystery and silence. But over time, something strange began to happen. He grew used to the limitations of his flesh. The weakness, the hunger, even the pain. They became companions, familiar, human. He learned to smile, though it never quite reached his eyes. He laughed sometimes, awkwardly, as if testing the sound. And he began to form attachments. A woman on the desert world of Garion taught him music. Her name was Leora. She played a harp built from bones and wire. He never told her what he was. When she died in a sandstorm, he mourned for a week in the ruins of her home, carving her name into the stone wall with his fingers until they bled. A child, Darren, called him Uncle on a mining outpost, following him everywhere. When Darren was taken by a slaver gang, Charon slaughtered them all in a fury that terrified even him. He had rebuilt the boy's shattered legs and carried him back through the ash wastes, whispering stories of ancient stars to keep him awake. Each connection made him more human, and yet, deep inside, something stirred. Not guilt, not grief, but fear. He had built his new life on lies and borrowed time. Sooner or later, someone would see too much. A Medicae would examine his blood. A psyker would sense his absence of soul. An inquisitor would ask questions no one else dared ask. And what then? Could he fight? He had the knowledge. The buried Cryptek within still held devastating secrets. But each time he even contemplated unleashing that power, a sickness spread in his chest. He was no longer a Necron. He had chosen this pain. He had earned it. So he fled again, always to darker, quieter corners of the galaxy. Trying to bury his past beneath layers of sweat, labor, and longing. Always hoping the tombs would forget him. Always fearing they would not. He studied them, these strange, emotional, infinitely chaotic creatures called humans. He watched their rituals, their fears, their worship. In the cathedrals of the ecclesiarchy, he stood at the back, observing as men and women lit incense, chanted praise to a dead god, and wept as if anyone was listening. The god emperor of mankind. A corpse on a golden throne, a symbol of salvation, a tyrant in stasis. The irony burned in him, for he had once knelt before a god too. The Tan had been gods once, to him, to his people. Real, tangible entities. He had stood beneath the hungry gaze of the Deceiver, the Nightbringer, and others whose names had been scoured from memory. And he had seen what divine power looked like. Not mercy, but consumption. Not salvation, but slavery. The Imperium worshipped a god who had likely known the truth, fought those very beings, and now allowed himself to become a myth. It was obscene. It was tragic, it was human. He did not believe, could not, but he mimicked everything. He learned the words of their prayers, adjusted his breathing patterns to simulate the rhythm of reverence. He knelt when others knelt, he bowed when others bowed. The act was not just camouflage, it was penance. For he had played God once, helped build a system that obliterated a people. Now, in his false humility, he sought some form of atonement, not from the Emperor, but from himself. One day, in a shrine dedicated to Saint Basilia the Burning Rose, a confessor took notice. The man was old, half-blind, yet sharp as flensing steel. He asked Charon questions, small at first: name, origin, vocation. Charon lied, of course, but not convincingly. The confessor smiled, not in suspicion but in pity. "You are broken," the man whispered. "I see it in your silence, not sinful, not corrupted, just lost." The words cut deeper than any Gauss flare ever could. Charon said nothing. The confessor placed a hand on his shoulder, a gentle, human gesture. The Emperor forgives the lost if they seek the light, even if they can never truly find it. Charon wanted to believe that. He wanted to imagine that some cosmic force, even one built on contradiction and decay, could offer him a path back to peace. But belief, real belief, required something he did not possess: a soul. He experimented, not in the lab, but in the mind. He meditated in the style of the redemptionist ascetics, fasting until his synthetic organs began to collapse. He self-flagellated with a neural whip, seeking that edge where pain becomes clarity. He even entered a pilgrimage caravan bound for Terra's outer systems, enduring weeks of religious fervor, chants, visions, none of which moved him. But something unexpected did happen. He began to envy them. Not their ignorance, not their obedience, but their certainty. Their faith. It gave them meaning, purpose. Even in death, they died screaming their god's name, convinced they mattered. Charon had once known certainty, back when he believed in science and salvation through transference. That certainty had died with his daughter. He began to ask dangerous questions, not of others, but of himself. Could a machine find faith? Could an artificial man love a real god? If the Emperor was truly divine, would he recognize Charon's pain, or would he obliterate it as a mockery? Then came the test. On a fringe world ravaged by warp storms, he posed as a field medic in a Scala Progenium outpost. When demonic entities breached the veil and descended upon the outpost, faith alone held the defenders together. Charon fought beside them, using forbidden knowledge to seal rifts, stabilize minds, and burn the unclean. He used psychic inhibitors built from Necron tech, disguised as holy relics. The enemy recoiled. The defenders survived. Afterward, they called it a miracle. They said the Emperor had guided him, that his hands were blessed. A statue was erected in his honor, not of him, but of a nameless saint with burning eyes and silver skin. He disappeared that night. He could not be a martyr. He could not be a saint. But perhaps in the gaps between prayers, in the quiet moments when no one looked, he could be something like faithful. In time, he built a small chapel of his own, hidden beneath a mining colony, not to the Emperor, not to the Ktan, but to memory. Inside, he placed objects, a data crystal with his daughter's laugh, a rusted wrench from his first job on a hive world, a bone harp string from Leora. He lit candles and sat in silence, not expecting grace, but creating space for it nonetheless. Faith, he realized, might not be about gods. It might be about meaning, about choosing to care in a universe that no longer does. And in that, perhaps even a Necron could pray. He had become adept at vanishing, changing names, altering appearance slightly with dermal pigmentation masks and subtle muscular restructuring. Always careful, always drifting. But anonymity in the Imperium is never perfect, not forever. Eventually someone notices, someone wonders, and sometimes someone remembers. It began with symbols, glyphs etched into ruins, not unlike those he once carved into the walls of his hidden labs. Too precise, too deliberate. The shapes told a story only a Cryptek would understand. The mathematics of transference, of consciousness modulation, and beneath it all, a name encoded in impossible fractals. His name. Necron froze. For the first time in decades, he felt the ancient logic core in his mind stir, the cold Necron instincts waking from hibernation. Someone was calling him. Not in words, not in speech, but in the language of his people. Not a message, a warning. The tomb world had not forgotten. More likely, they had been watching all along, waiting for his technology to resurface. Perhaps it was the warp rift containment grid he deployed on the demon world. Or the healing matrix he left behind for a dying noble child. He had been careless. Or maybe, just maybe, he had wanted to be found. Then came the arrival. A slow corruption of systems across the moon colony he had come to call home. Mining servitors malfunctioned. Auspex sweeps picked up signal anomalies that Imperial tech could not decipher. Civilians began to vanish, not in clusters but strategically, deliberately. The patterns were familiar, too familiar. And then one night he heard it, a sound no human could detect. A carrier wave in Necron frequencies, a call to surrender, a summons. They had sent another Cryptek. She arrived in a vessel cloaked in non-Euclidean geometry, a spike of alien design buried in the heart of the mountain. Necron approached it not as prey, but as kin. He found her in the ruins of a Mechanicus observatory, surrounded by shattered data slates and dissected cogitators. Her form was regal, lean, adorned in shimmering necrodermis robes, and with a face eerily like his own, if only because their creator minds had once worked from the same biological memory base. She called herself Naresha, though that was not her original name. Her voice, not heard, but received directly into the core of his resurrected mind, was a siren song of logic and inevitability. She did not rage, she did not threaten. She invited. Necron, what you have done is unprecedented, but not unforgivable. Come home, let us study what you have become. He asked why. Why now, after all this time? Why not send an annihilation phalanx? A death mark? Why her? Because, she said, he had proven something they could not ignore. He had crossed a threshold. Not merely stolen flesh, but retained self. That was supposed to be impossible. If what he had done could be replicated, the implications were cosmic. No longer would they need soulless shells. No longer would they be cursed to wear the echo of immortality. They could feel again. But Necron knew better. He had paid the price for that feeling. The doubt, the fear, the love, the loss, all the things the Necrons had given up in pursuit of eternal order. He told her no. He would not go back. That path was closed. She did not insist. She simply asked for a copy of his neural architecture, just a shard, for study, for understanding, for salvation. He almost did it. He almost gave her what she wanted, not out of fear, but out of the faint, treacherous hope that maybe his people could learn to be more. But then he saw her eyes, cold, calculating, not with curiosity but hunger, not a desire to feel, a desire to control. And in that moment, he realized the Necrons would never change. Not really. Not until they learned to die again. The battle was short. He had not forgotten how to kill. He destroyed her vessel with a harmonic cascade bomb, vaporizing the mountainside and erasing all traces of Necron tech. Her shell fought hard, but she had not expected emotion, not expected rage. His flesh was clumsy, but it was wild, unpredictable, and when her core finally shattered beneath his hands, he screamed not in victory but in mourning. She was the last Cryptek he would ever see, perhaps the last kin of any kind. Afterward, he buried what remained of her, a finger, an eye, a strand of necrodermis hair, in the ash and said a prayer in the old Necrontyr tongue. Not for forgiveness, but for peace. The Imperium never knew what happened. The explosion was blamed on a reactor breach. The mountain was quarantined. Charon disappeared again, deeper than before. He erased more of himself, made his signature more diffuse, harder to track, but he knew the past would come again. The dead do not sleep forever, and he, more than anyone, knew that the sins of the Necrontyr still had long shadows. The deeper he wandered into the Imperium, the more the question gnawed at him. Not whether he could live as a human, he had proven that, in fragments, for years. But what he was now, a Necron mind in flesh, a copy of a dead soul, a ghost mimicking the living? The lines blurred, and with each act of kindness or rage he felt the gap widen between what he remembered and what he had become. He had buried his past, or tried to, but it remained like radiation beneath the skin. Every child's laugh was a needle reminding him of his own daughter's final breath. Every sunrise over a hab-domed skyline reminded him of worlds his people had turned to glass. And still he moved forward, driven by something that even now he struggled to name. He did not want redemption. Not truly. He did not believe it was possible. But he did want understanding. And so, on a world blanketed by eternal night, a mining moon near the halo stars, he built one final sanctum. Here, in the crust of an unremarkable asteroid, he constructed his last lab. But it was no longer a place of sterile experiments and cybernetic splicing. It was something else entirely. A cathedral of memory. Each chamber was a physical expression of a moment he could not forget. A hallway of sculpted faces, each one a life he had touched. A chamber filled with harmonized data streams, each encoded with the emotional echoes of voices long gone. A garden, artificial yet verdant, where synthetic bees pollinated real flowers and the air smelled of soil and wet leaves. He called it the Schism. Not because it was broken, but because it was where he came apart and reassembled himself. Here, he no longer ran. Here he listened. In the silence of the Schism, he let himself feel everything. The weight of millions of deaths, the cold pride of his Cryptek self, the warmth of a child's hug, the bitterness of betrayal. He played recordings of human laughter until it made him cry. He injected himself with simulated neurochemical storms to replicate grief, love, longing. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but enough. And when he finally sat, breath steady, heart stable, mind quiet, he asked himself the question he had avoided all these years. Was I ever truly human to begin with? The answer came not in words, but in sensation. He thought of Leora's harp, of Darren's laughter, of the confessor's pity. He thought of the woman who gave him bread without asking for his name, and of the soldier who bled out in his arms while whispering prayers to a god Charon could not follow. He thought of himself, walking endlessly through a galaxy that did not want him, and yet choosing every time not to hate it. That choice, he realized, was humanity. Not flesh, not faith, not even the soul, but the decision to feel, to fall, to rise again. That fragile, maddening will to live despite the cruelty of it all. That was what he had chased. That was what he had reclaimed. He left the Schism then, sealed it behind walls of folded dimension. Not to forget, but to preserve. A museum of a life that should not have been possible. A monument to a heresy that in another time might have been hope. And he walked back into the galaxy. Not as Charon the Cryptek, not even as a man, but as a soul-shaped question. A reminder that even in the age of darkness, light can be forged in the most unnatural of places. And to those who hear the whispers of a strange traveler who knows too much and smiles too little, know this: he is still out there. Watching, wandering, becoming. The stars are silent judges. They do not speak, they do not remember. But they watch, somewhere, beyond the edge of the segmentum obscurus, where warp storms form a wall between the known and the unknowable. A small rogue world drifts, It has no designation, no tactical value. It is a graveyard, a memory ossuary of forgotten wars and discarded faiths. And there, in the wreckage of a ruined convent of the Adepta Sororitas, the Cryptek-turned man built his last conversation with the past. He had come seeking quiet, not peace, for he no longer believed in such things. The world had once been sanctified, but now only broken stone and rusted statuary remained. The wind here didn't scream, it sighed, as if the planet itself mourned the faith it had lost. And in the heart of what was once a chapel, where a shattered Aquila hung like a broken promise, he found the remains of a sister of battle. Her bones had not crumbled. Her armor, though blackened by plasma fire, still bore the marks of her order, the icon of the Ebon Chalice. A bolter lay beside her, mag-locked into skeletal fingers. Around her neck was a broken rosary, each bead carved with a Latanic verse. But what caught his attention was what lay beside her. Not a weapon, but a journal. He did not need to hack it. The binding was cracked open by time, the ink faded but readable. Its final entries were written in trembling script, fragmented and desperate. They told the story of a battle lost, a last stand against cultists who had made this world their altar. She had held the line not because she expected rescue, but because it was her duty. Because belief, even in the face of annihilation, was purpose enough. He read every word. Not as a scholar, not as a Cryptek dissecting data, but as a man trying to understand why. Why did she choose to die when she might have fled? Why stay and pray in the face of certain doom? Why trust in something she could not see? And as he stared at the journal, the wind carrying the scent of scorched stone, he whispered something he had not dared speak aloud in decades. "Were you stronger than me?" He buried her. Not in Necron protocol, not in silence, but with human ritual. He carved a crude gravestone from the remnants of a shrine wall, inscribing her name, Sister Moran Vost, using a fusion cutter as a chisel. He placed the rosary back in the grave, looped around her bolter. Then he sat by the grave and began to speak. He told her his story, not all of it, not the names of star gods or soul forges, but the truth that mattered. That he had once chosen to become something no one should be. That he had helped build an empire of silence and steel. That he had killed for logic and cursed himself for mercy. That he had clawed his way out of machinehood, not for power, but for the chance to suffer again, to deserve his pain. He told her about Leora and the harp she played, about Darren and the way he laughed like a wind chime, about the confessor who called him broken and meant it kindly, and about the Cryptek who came to take him back, who died with her hands around his throat and tears in his eyes. He did not expect forgiveness. But still, he spoke. And when his voice faltered, he read her journal again, as if to remind himself that her story was not a fiction, that faith had weight. When he left the world, he did not leave unchanged. In the ruins of a dead sister's chapel, he found something more profound than faith. He found witness. He had lived too long in hiding, too long pretending to be silent. But her story, her refusal to be forgotten, awakened something in him. Not purpose, not absolution, but memory. A memory of standing at a forge, his hands covered in blood and machine oil, whispering to himself that this must be the only way. That eternal life was better than pain. That silence was mercy. He now knew how wrong he had been. Back on his ship, a slow, creaking freighter with scavenged Geller field patches, he installed the journal on the main altar of his personal chapel. Not beneath a shrine to any god, just beneath a single word, remember. And for the first time in years, he transmitted something into the void. Not to the Imperium, not to the Necron dynasties, just a signal, low band, encrypted, ancient Necrontyr frequency. It said, "I lived, and it hurt, and I'm still here." No answer would come. He didn't need one. He just needed the stars to keep watching. The winter world of Kaldrith Prime was dying. Its core had begun to cool centuries ago, and with each passing decade the temperature fell by another fraction, slowly entombing the entire surface beneath a growing sheet of ice. The Imperium had long abandoned it. The last settlements had fallen silent 50 years before, and the Mechanicus mining colonies had extracted the final dregs of mineral wealth from the crust before withdrawing. Now only machines remained, grinding through automated cycles, unaware their masters would never return. Charon came not for profit, nor for survival. He came because he had heard a pattern, a a forgotten distress beacon buried under subharmonic static. Most would have dismissed it. The administratum would have catalogued it as background noise. But he recognized the pattern. The cadence was Necrontyr in origin, though fractured, scattered, almost as if encoded by someone who no longer fully remembered how. His shuttle descended through hurricane winds and ion-sheathed clouds, creaking against forces no sane pilot would brave. When he landed, it was atop a long-dead mountain facility once belonging to the Ordo Xenos. Their symbol, a stylized eye encircled by flame, was barely visible beneath the frost. The doors had been sealed for decades, welded shut and warded. But something inside was still transmitting. The facility had once studied alien relics, Xenos technology, captured Tyranid strains, even whispers of Eldari soulstones. But the thing that now pulled Charon forward was more personal. As he wandered through frost-choked corridors and collapsed stairways, he began to see signs of Necron work. Not modern, not active, but old, ancient. Carved in sorrow, not command. And then, in the sublevels beneath the facility's data crypts, he found it. A containment sarcophagus, cracked but still humming with minimal power. It was not a tomb, not exactly. It was a preservation chamber, and inside was not a warrior, not a machine, but a child. Or at least something that looked like one. She was small, barely 4 feet in height, draped in tattered robes layered with composite mesh. Her skin shimmered with faint necrodermis overlay, but her face was organic. The fusion was crude, unstable, the work of a desperate hand. And her mind, when Charon reached for it, was fractured, not broken, not empty, fragmented like crystal after an impact, still reflecting light from 1,000 angles. She spoke to him in emotion, not in words. Fear, hope, longing. Her memories were indistinct. She remembered warmth and a lullaby composed of harmonic frequencies he recognized as Necron morning rites. She remembered a man, tall, sharp, with eyes like green fire, telling her stories beneath a black sky. She remembered being built and yet loved. She was somehow the product of another Cryptek's attempt. Not a warrior, not a spy. A child, a synthesis of flesh and machine, emotion and code. The first true offspring of a species that had long since forgotten how to be parents. And Charon felt something in himself crack. He had believed himself alone, a singular anomaly. But this girl, this impossible creation, proved otherwise. Someone else had tried. Perhaps not for the same reasons. Perhaps they failed, but they had tried, and they had left this child behind, hidden in a human vault, hoping someone, anyone, would find her and understand. He named her Virith. She could not speak, not yet. Her vocal systems were underdeveloped, and her neural pathways still rebuilding. But she followed him as he moved through the ruins, her steps light, her gaze wide. She would touch machines, and they would react. She would hum broken notes that caused shattered cogitators to stutter back to life. She was not just a child, she was a resonance, a bridge between what was and what could be. Charon could have left her. He knew the dangers. If the Necron dynasties learned of her, they would dissect her, not understand her. If the Imperium found her, she would be declared abominatus and destroyed. Even the Eldar would not spare her. To them, she would be another artificial blasphemy. But as he watched her sleep, curled in a bed of scavenged cloth and silent servitor plating, he realized he could no longer pretend to be an outsider. He had become part of something. And now, for the first time since his daughter had died so many aeons ago, he had something to protect. They stayed on Caldrith Prime for 1 standard month. He rebuilt systems, restored power to lower levels, and scoured every log, every remnant. He found recordings left by the facility's last Magos, a woman named Kelia Trask, who had sacrificed herself to seal Virith inside when the Inquisition came. She had not known what the girl was, only that she was kind. That was enough for her to die for. When it was time to leave, he carried Virith aboard his shuttle, wrapped in a cloak of synth fur and blessed wires. She looked back at the ruins as they lifted off, and for the first time, she spoke a word. Just one. Faint. Electronic, but clear. Home. Charon did not cry, he no longer had the right, but something inside him broke again. And this time, it wasn't pain. It was hope. Wounded, fragile, staggering hope. If she could be born, if she could learn and feel, then perhaps even now the future could be rewritten. Not with war, not with conquest, but with care. One broken soul at a time. Understanding how a Necron Cryptek could feasibly engineer a human-like flesh body begins with appreciating the foundational technologies of Necron science. The Necrons are not merely ancient. Their mastery over matter, energy, and consciousness predates the rise of the Eldar and even the Warp as a dominant galactic force. Their technologies operate on principles often referred to as impossible by Imperial scientists, primarily because they integrate quantum manipulation, bioenergetic pattern encoding, and phase space modulation, all at scales and precision humanity cannot replicate. The Crypteks, in particular, were and remain the intellectual elite of their species, blending scientific acumen with arcane processes that blur the lines between engineering and metaphysics. During the biotransference, the Necrontyr were stripped of their organic bodies and had their consciousnesses transferred into necrodermis shells, artificially grown metal bodies bound by complex quantum linkages to their original neuropatterns. While the process preserved function and intellect, it did so at the cost of sensation, emotion, and what one might loosely call the soul. For most Necrons, this was acceptable or became unnoticeable over time due to memory degradation and system corrosion. But for the Crypteks, whose understanding of what was lost was far deeper than the warrior castes, the result was trauma masked by logic. A Cryptek seeking to reverse biotransference would be pursuing a goal considered both sacrilegious and technically infeasible by his peers. Creating a flesh body, especially one capable of sustaining and expressing a Necron mind, would not just be a feat of engineering. It would be an act of philosophical rebellion against the very foundation of Necron survival. Nevertheless, theoretical pathways exist, and the Cryptek in question, having remained awake and conscious for millennia, had the time, focus, and emotional incentive to attempt it. The first obstacle would have been psychological. Suppressing the influence of the unified command protocols and mindnet directives that all Necrons are subject to. Most Necrons lack sufficient self-agency to even question their programming. However, ancient nobles and Crypteks of sufficient rank and isolation can, under the right conditions, develop a limited form of independence. This would explain how our subject, now operating under the name Charon, was able to pursue his experiments without immediate detection. The second challenge was anatomical. A Necron mind is not merely data, it is encoded into a quantum lattice that interfaces directly with necrodermis structures. This means the mind cannot simply be copied into a clone body. Instead, a unique medium would need to be developed, a hybrid neural lattice capable of translating Necron quantum states into bioelectrical signals that an organic nervous system could process. This likely required extensive experimentation with human neural tissue, perhaps incorporating elements of psycher brain matter to handle the strain of conscious translation. Once such a lattice was stable, Charon would then need to address tissue generation. The Imperium already possesses the capacity to grow vat bodies, servitors, clones, even replacement organs for nobles and high-value personnel. The Cryptek, having access to these sources through salvage or infiltration, could have utilized this infrastructure, but with one major difference. He would need the body to sustain an alien intelligence without rejecting it. This would necessitate modifications at the genetic level, likely creating an entirely synthetic species, human in form, but engineered to host a non-human mind. He would also have to simulate a soul. Not in the warp sense. Charon would remain invisible to daemons and psychers, but in a structural, emotional, and behavioral sense. This would mean replicating neurotransmitter functions, glandular responses, and emotional feedback loops so that his mind would not simply exist in flesh, but experience it. This level of detail would go far beyond infiltration or mimicry. It would be an attempt to re-enter the state of being alive, to feel, in the full sense of the word. Such a body would be unstable. It would require constant adjustment, maintenance, and adaptation. Organic tissue would not innately recognize or support the presence of a Necron intellect. Glitches, neural misfires, memory overlaps, and psychological distress would be common. Moreover, the emotional surge, guilt, grief, longing, that Charon reportedly experienced would have been overwhelming after eons of sensory absence. His ability to survive this phase is a testament not only to his willpower, but to the precision of his craftsmanship. After achieving embodiment, escape became critical. A flesh body, no matter how advanced, could not survive on a tomb world for long without detection. Necron sensor networks would have noted an unsanctioned biological presence. Charon's escape into Imperial space suggests that he had pre-planned this contingency, likely by forging a stealth-capable vessel using modified Necron cloaking technology. Once among the stars, he would have defaulted to low-visibility strategies, disguising himself as a drifter, a medicae, or a tech savant. This would allow him to blend in while studying human behavior and attempting to reconcile his own identity. In summary, the transformation of a Necron Cryptek into a flesh-bound being was not only theoretically possible within the upper echelons of Necron science, but was executed with a level of precision and insight unparalleled in recorded Xenos history. The process required suppressing ancient neural architectures, engineering a new form of body capable of hosting a machine mind, and navigating the psychological and existential crises that followed. It was not a single act, but a long, iterative journey. And it remains, to this day, the most extraordinary known case of a Necron voluntarily abandoning its immortality for the pain and beauty of being human. The psychological transformation experienced by Charon, the Cryptek who reconstructed himself into a human form, presents a unique case study in artificial identity evolution. While the technological feat of creating a viable flesh host for a Necron mind is staggering in itself, the more profound aspect lies in what followed: the slow, methodical process of re-socialization and the attempt to develop a new self-concept within an alien culture, the Imperium of Man. Understanding this phase requires examining the inherent tension between memory continuity, environmental influence, and the restructuring of cognitive architecture once removed from a machine collective. Charon's consciousness originated from a hyper-rational, non-emotive Necron command structure that functioned on protocol, efficiency, and deterministic outcomes. Even for a Cryptek, individuals who retained higher autonomy, emotional nuance and instinctive response were suppressed in favor of calculation and control. After millions of years under this system, awakening in a human body would not immediately reawaken old emotional patterns. Instead, the process would involve rebuilding effective cognition from near zero, relearning how to respond to stimuli, not as data, but as experience. Initial stages of Charon's resocialization likely involved mimicry. As with most machine intelligences exposed to unfamiliar societies, imitation becomes the primary adaptive mechanism. Observing human behavior in non-hostile environments such as labor camps, minor settlements, or frontier stations would have provided models for interaction. Tone, body language, facial expressions, and social hierarchies had to be understood not just linguistically, but emotionally. It is reported that he observed rather than engaged at first, which aligns with behavioral learning patterns among adaptive non-native intelligences. Emotional responses, such as empathy, sorrow, or awe, would not be immediately accessible. The simulation of these emotions, through behavior matching, might precede their actual internal experience. Over time, however, with sufficient exposure to human suffering, ritual, and storytelling, Charon would begin to form associative memory clusters. These would allow his synthetic neural architecture to begin processing emotion not as abstract information, but as subjective reality. An example of this transition can be seen in reports of his actions following the death of certain individuals he grew close to. He did not simply move on or abandon their memory as would be standard for a machine operating under utility logic. Instead, he preserved artifacts, constructed private memorials, and even adjusted his speech patterns to reflect linguistic quirks of those he had lost. These behaviors indicate not just an understanding of grief, but a personal experience of it, suggesting that the emotional core of the Necron self was not as thoroughly erased during biotransference as once believed. Another key element of his adaptation was his relationship to belief systems. Though incapable of genuine spiritual experience in the traditional Imperial sense, lacking a warp presence or soul signature, Charon made sustained efforts to integrate into faith-based communities. This was not merely for camouflage. His repeated attendance at religious gatherings, memorization of catechisms, and construction of personal shrines indicates a deep philosophical curiosity about the nature of meaning and mortality. Faith, for him, became a context through which human behavior could be interpreted and perhaps even emulated. Crucially, Charon did not pursue belief as truth, but as structure. He understood that belief gave humans the ability to suffer with purpose. It gave them reasons to fight, to forgive, and to die without regret. For a being who had once traded mortality for function, only to regret it for millennia, this concept held enormous weight. The pursuit of belief systems, not as divine realities but as emotional scaffolding, allowed him to construct an internal moral compass, independent of Necron code or imperial doctrine. There is also evidence of psychological compartmentalization. While operating within human society, Charon maintained strict mental boundaries between his past and present identities. He rarely, if ever, referred to his life before embodiment, unless absolutely necessary. This form of identity management is common in trauma survivors, an apt comparison given that his resurrection into flesh likely constituted a severe psychic rupture. By separating the Necron from the man, he could more effectively engage in human interactions without the constant burden of historical self-contradiction. However, compartmentalization also came at a cost. The longer Charon remained embedded in human society, the more strained these internal divisions became. Emotional leakage from suppressed memories, unexpected reactions to stimuli, and moral dissonance between past actions and present values would have created psychological instability. He would have needed to construct an internal mythology, not necessarily based on truth, but on coherence. This would help him maintain a sense of continuity without collapsing under the contradictions of his own history. Over time, this internal mythology likely evolved into something resembling a personal philosophy, one that rejected deterministic purpose in favor of self-authored meaning. Evidence suggests that Charon began to see his continued survival not as a glitch, but as a responsibility. He interpreted his anomalous existence as a chance to explore what it meant to be something entirely new, neither Necron nor human, but a third path. This is evident in his later actions, protecting civilians, refusing to rejoin Necron ranks, and ultimately mentoring younger outcasts. He had transitioned from escapee to exemplar. In the final analysis, Charon's transformation was not only technological or biological, but existential. He proved that identity is not fixed by origin, but shaped by choice, memory, and connection. He demonstrated that even a mind forged in the coldest crucible of logic could relearn warmth. And perhaps most importantly, he showed that being human is not about anatomy or biology, it is about what one chooses to value when given the freedom to decide. If you followed his journey from the sterile tombs of a soulless empire to the choking hive air of forgotten moons, then you understand now why this story matters. It isn't just about a Cryptek defying his code or flesh regrown in blasphemous defiance of ancient laws. It's about the unimaginable war between identity and purpose, between past and possibility. It's about whether something forged in cruelty can ever learn kindness, whether a being that once helped doom a galaxy can still deserve to walk in its light. You won't find his name in any records. The Imperium will never sing his praises. The Necron dynasties would erase every whisper of his existence if they could. But in the cracks of the galaxy, in those rare moments where the machine breaks and something new crawls from the wreckage, he is there. A ghost in flesh. A mind that chose pain. A machine that chose to feel. And maybe, just maybe, that's what hope really looks like in the grimdark of the 41st millennium. If you want more stories like this, deep, emotional, and filled with the mysteries Warhammer keeps in its darkest corners, then subscribe now. There's so much more to uncover, and you won't want to miss the next journey.